Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm coming to you from New Zealand where it's dark, but I'm very happy to be here because I'm speaking about a subject which I'm very passionate about, and that's promoting systemic change in shallow markets. When I think about shallow markets, I think of characteristics like small markets with few market actors, geographically dispersed with a low density of market actors, few types of products, a lack of support functions, unclear or no regulations, weak or non-existent market institutions, etc. So why do we care about these type of markets? Well, over the last couple of decades, global poverty rates have declined dramatically, and that's great. But the people that are living in poverty today are often surrounded by shallow markets. And it's the dysfunction of these shallow markets that's one of the contributing factors to their poverty, because they cannot get access to the goods and services, markets, and jobs that they need to get out of poverty. In addition, market systems development has evolved a lot since we started around 15 years ago. It's now being applied in many different kinds of markets around the world, and many of those markets are shallow. So that's why we need to get better at understanding these types of markets and applying MSD in them. So in my presentation today, I'm going to use the example of the Market Development Facility. This is an MSD program that's operating now in 5 countries, and it's currently in its 2nd phase. And I'm going to be using examples from Pakistan and Fiji in this presentation. And I first want to start out actually with an example of systemic change in a robust market to provide a comparison. So let's look at the livestock market in Pakistan, which is one of MDF's target sectors. There are over 6 million households in Pakistan that have some dependency on livestock for their livelihoods. And there's also a growing demand for dairy and for meat, particularly in urban centers, and that's fueling the growth of the market. So one of the problems for farmers, particularly small farmers, is that poor nutrition for their livestock keeps productivity low. And one of the answers to this problem is nutritious fodder for the animals. So well before MDF came on the scene, there were various government and donor programs that were promoting silage, which is one type of nutritious fodder for livestock. But the uptake among small farmers in particular was low. MDF partnered with Pioneer, a leading agribusiness company, to pilot a business model of rural entrepreneurs making and selling silage in small bales that small farmers could afford. Pioneer helped identify the entrepreneurs and provided technical and marketing support, while MDF provided financial support. And the uptake was rapid. Within 12 months, the business model was already profitable. And silage entrepreneurs started to independently adapt the business model. For example, some of them rented their machinery to other farmers who had some land to grow maize for silage. Some of them contracted farmers to grow maize for them for the silage. And within 2.5 years, the number of entrepreneurs and other companies producing silage in small bales had grown from the initial 15 supported by the project to over 100. MDF partnered then with a bank and a farm equipment company to make it easier for farmers to purchase silage making equipment. And this led to another equipment importer starting to import silage making machinery and new equipment on the market for small bales and packages. And the increased competition led to decreasing prices and more machinery rental businesses. 2 local companies started producing UV-coated wrapping film for the bales, which previously had to be imported. So by 2017, some small farmers were buying small bales of silage and getting 2 to 4 additional liters of milk per animal per day. Livestock were saving 14 hours a week of men, and the market was diversified. So this is sort of a classic story of systemic change. And if you look at the dots on the bottom of your screen, they represent this change process. a single innovation that holds behind it, crowding in, and then new products and services that make a market grow to be bigger, more diverse, and more inclusive. Okay, let's contrast this with the agricultural inputs market in Fiji. So ag inputs was part of a sector strategy in horticulture in MDF Fiji. The strategy overall aimed to enable small farmers to grow more and more in demand horticultural crops for export so that they could increase their incomes. And there are approximately 70,000 farming households in Fiji, and they're spread islands and many, many smaller ones. So the picture you see on your screen is when MDF started in 2011. There were very few types of agricultural inputs available. There was only one seed importer and one importer of crop care products. There were less than 20 retailers nationwide selling ag inputs, and their range was both expensive and limited. There were a few nurseries, but they were mostly donor-driven and set up to supply development projects. And the few retailers really had very limited reach. So if you were a farmer and you wanted to get ag inputs, you often had to travel pretty far to those few retailers, which was particularly difficult for women with limited time. The public sector was focused only on a few farmers in terms of ag inputs, mostly sugarcane, and their means of extension often only reached men. So in total, if we look at this picture, small farmers weren't really perceived as good business by input suppliers, by buyers, or by government. They were considered beneficiaries, not businesses. Over the next 6 years, MDF had about a dozen interventions in this market and lots of engagement with the market actors and with government. Initially, they focused their partnerships on diversifying the availability of ag inputs, so getting new ag inputs into the market. For example, they partnered with a large manufacturer of concrete who had a lime quarry and could produce agricultural lime locally, which improved soil quality. They partnered with a seedling provider to expand and focus on commercial sales, particularly for export-oriented products. They partnered with the first commercial tissue culture company in Fiji to provide quality planting materials. And these types of interventions increased the variety of ag inputs available, but distribution really didn't improve that much. So MDF partnered with two hardware wholesalers with extensive distribution channels and supported them to add ag inputs to their product mix and link with the importers of those products. They partnered with a logistics company to improve inter-island shipping for agri inputs, among other products. And by 2017, there were starting to be significant signs of market development. New types of ag inputs were available. Seedling providers were starting to operate commercially and were linked to the tissue culture company for planting materials. Major distributors were adding ag products to their product mix, and this meant that ag inputs were now available through their much more extensive retail networks, so much closer to the farmers. Finance was starting to be available to some of the players in the market. Government was becoming more responsive and cooperating more with the private sector. So, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture was helping to raise farmers' awareness about the availability and effectiveness of new inputs. And government and some companies were recognizing women's role in farming and starting to target them as a good market. So we really started to see the perception of small farmers change. So that government and companies saw them as customers and suppliers rather than beneficiaries. And those small farmers that were using the new inputs were increasing their productivity and earning more income. And women in particular were getting access to information and inputs, often for the first time. So let's look at that change process in contrast to the robust market process. In the Fiji case, one innovation, agricultural lime in this case, locally produced, it didn't catalyze broader changes. In fact, it took several companies investing in different ag inputs for other companies to take notice. MDF's partners required more time and more mentoring to make changes. And the fact that new ag inputs were available didn't automatically lead to better distribution. MDF had to partner with several companies to kickstart that better distribution. And throughout this, MDF had to actively and consistently broker linkages among companies and government and other stakeholders. And once there were these multiple innovations and links in the market, then other companies began to crowd in or innovate related products and services, and government began to be more responsive. So the systemic change did happen, but it took a bit longer, and importantly, it was not led by one single innovation, but by multiple innovations and links in a range of related products and services. So let's unpack a little bit more the difference between these types of markets. If we think about systemic change, the processes needed to push systemic change along are affected by the characteristics of markets that make them more robust or more shallow. Let's take adaptation, a critical part of systemic change. In Pakistan, medium and large-scale firms had the capacity to adapt business models on their own. In Fiji, this was much less so. There were no large firms dedicated to ag inputs. Most firms were small or medium, first-generation businesses with limited financial and organizational capacity. Looking at information flows. In Pakistan, information flowed really well in the large, dense market among farmers, but also among silage firms and large businesses. In Fiji, there were also pretty decent information flows, but within limited geographical areas, and much less so to other areas, particularly different islands. And it was also hard for firms to get enough information to copy or adapt business models that were very new to them. In Pakistan, we saw that the large, dense market and the competition provided incentives to innovate. And we also saw that the change that farmers needed to make was relatively small. They already knew about silage, but they just needed to buy it in smaller bales, and it was just one input. In Fiji, we had a much smaller market and with not a very good reputation. And this didn't provide a strong incentive to innovate or to copy. In addition, the change that farmers had to make was much more significant, often going from no inputs to multiple inputs. And the change that firms needed to make was also bigger because many of them were entering agriculture for the first time. Looking at coordination, the Pakistan firms had relationships with other market actors, such as logistics and finance providers. But in Fiji, they didn't. And critically about the adjustment of perceptions and norms. In Pakistan, those medium-sized silage entrepreneurs were an ideal choice to target small farmers because they were in rural areas and already knew them. But in Fiji, we had a legacy of donor-supported approach that meant small farmers were not really considered commercial actors, and it took many demonstrations to change this perception. So what does this mean for us? Well, from what I've learned, it shows that in shallow markets, it doesn't work very well to think intervention by intervention. We have to plan at the sector level and to consider the links among interventions right from the start. So, for example, in Fiji, MDF needed to consider the link between an intervention area on new ag inputs with an intervention area on distribution of ag inputs. And they needed to consider how to link the various changes together to generate the coordination and the momentum to drive change. Now, in any MSD program, it's a good idea to reflect and replan and replan and to sort of integrate design and implementation. But that's even more so in shallow markets because programs often hit roadblocks. In Fiji, the concrete company that MDF partnered with often saw producing agricultural lime as a side business, and they would neglect it in favor of their main business, which is construction materials. The MDF partnered with the state-owned Fiji Sugar Corporation, and they encouraged the use of locally produced ag lime. And this is sort of important in showing the value of this business to this larger company. And overall, we really saw MDF's picture of how systemic change was happening in this ag inputs market change over the years that it worked in it. It was very much an evolving picture of how systemic change was happening. Also, lessons learned in implementation. It is definitely hard to get change going in shallow markets, so it really helps to prioritize very visible change, especially early on. So for example, ag lime was a very visible new product on the market, and it was from a big, well-known company. And it also had a dramatic effect on yields. So you can see the quote from the farmer on the slide about how much yields increased, and this was very visible for farmers. It's also important to be hands-on. It took 3 years of MDF mentoring and many, many meetings between the company and government for a new seed importer in Fiji to get clearance to import additional seed varieties. And the company admitted that they would have given up without MDF's consistent encouragement and support with getting through the details. So of course, we always need to be careful to keep local stakeholders in the driving seat. But the reality is that shallow markets do require a more hands-on approach. In many small markets, it's not possible to specialize. And it's important that we understand the markets well enough to craft business models with market actors that will be viable. For example, in Fiji, it wouldn't have been possible for distributors to focus solely on distributing ag inputs in more remote locations. Ag inputs had to be one of many products that they were distributing. And MDF also looked outside of agriculture for businesses to fill different gaps, because there weren't often businesses in agriculture that could do that. In all MSD programs, we work with change agents and we encourage coordination, but that is, again, particularly important in shallow markets. We need to really think about how we link those interventions together. So for example, MDF actively linked innovative importers with innovative distributors. It linked change agents in companies to change agents in governments, so they got a multi-pronged change process happening. And this active coordination is really needed to push change in shallow markets. Okay, I want to close with just a few ideas on what I think we need to do differently or more in order to push our understanding in shallow markets. The first is that, in my experience, frameworks that focus on single interventions with an emphasis, for example, on crowding in, aren't very useful in shallow markets. We need frameworks that are built around this change process that we're seeing in shallow markets that's more multidimensional and that can help us unpack these markets and really think through how to influence them effectively. As part of that, we need better ways to track changes at different levels and to understand how different changes influence each other. We need to go beyond tracking change in behavior and performance and also look at issues like perceptions, information flows, relationships, capacity, and coordination in markets. And more than anything, we need to share our experiences more. Without a doubt, the process of systemic change in shallow markets is not as spectacular as in robust markets. So it often doesn't become the subject of case studies. And sometimes, actually, programs even have a hard time identifying if systemic change is happening because it happens in interlinked markets and more gradually. But we need to look for it. We need to share it more because if we can improve our understanding, this will contribute to our effectiveness, and we can reach those excluded populations that depend on shallow markets. So that's it for me. For more information, I put a link to the paper we wrote on this topic at the bottom, and I really look forward to hearing others' experiences and ideas, starting with Collins. So I'll hand it back to you, Mike.
Many thanks, Ali. That was a very, very articulate presentation and very interesting. Collins is now going to talk about the experience of the Northern Uganda program, which also was operating in a very thin environment. Collins, are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. Very welcome to the Beam webinar.
All right.
Are you going to put up your slides? Excellent, thank you.
Has it come through?
It's just loading and it's there now, yes, if you want to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Hello, everyone. My name is Colin Apuoyo. I'm sitting out of Kampala, Uganda, and I'm going to share with you very briefly what we are doing in order to stimulate systemic change in a shallow market in northern Uganda.
Collins, just to interrupt you, sorry, you haven't yet got your slides up, so you want to switch to your PowerPoint.
Oh, yes, I thought it was up. Okay, are you able to see it?
Yeah, we can see. Yes, if you want to start that show, we'll be away. There we go.
Okay, is that okay?
It's perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how we are stimulating systemic change in a shallow market in northern Uganda. And I want to mention right up front that it is still very early days, and we are starting to see small changes in the market, actually structural changes that are showing us that we are actually starting to achieve systemic change. So very quickly, the slide up there is simply talking about NU-TEC market development program. We are private sector focused. We work in a region of northern Uganda, and we use M4P approach, working with private sector actors to implement inclusive business model that brings smallholder farmers into markets. Our aim is to achieve a 15% increase in incomes over the project lifetime to 75,000 poor households. And just to let you know that the program also focuses on getting refugees into the market space. So it has components that are directly market-oriented, but also addressing refugee crisis that is in northern Uganda. So I'll go straight into looking at some of the characteristics that are very true of northern Uganda. There is a small market with relatively few actors. There are about, you can say, 5 big actors that you find working in that market. But there are very many small indigenous businesses that are struggling to even get going, and in many cases, those small indigenous businesses are not targeted by donor programs. The area is very geographically dispersed with very poor infrastructure. It is formerly deserted because of civil war. The area is relatively remote, and currently a big section of that area is dominated by refugees from 5 different countries. There is very little specialization in terms of economic activity, but one thing is for sure, that northern Uganda is like the hinterland or the area that produces the largest amount of grains to other parts of Uganda and East Africa. So you will find that the area is more dominated by traders, and very few people are interested in long-term investment in that area. You find more of extractive sort of investment that are just about taking what has already been done without investing anything back there. Then very few support services are available in northern Uganda. It is very difficult, actually not possible, to get a BDS service provider in the area. What you find are NGOs have gone in there and created some business development services and small outfits that try to give business consultancy services, but those do not meet the rigorous need for business analysis and market analysis that can support any business. There is lack of clear regulation and government practice out there. Why I say this is because we know that the central government in Kampala is trying its level best to put regulations and to have district systems to manage issues around inputs and around marketing, but because of capacity within government, you find that those regulations are not implemented appropriately, and therefore you find a lot of adulterated products being sold in that market. Weak or non-existent market institutions, well, we do have farmer organizations and private sector associations, but most of these are donor-facing. They were established with the hope of getting funding from donors. Very few are actually operating because they see a real market opportunity to operate in. I want to then mention something that we have noticed in northern Uganda, and I'm sure this is applicable to areas where there are shallow markets all over the world. When donors go, or programs like ours go into these shallow markets, the tendency is to try and work with the few large players or actors who are there. And what we quickly do is you find 10 or 15 or 20 NGOs all running to work with one player. Then we give subsidy, and that subsidy is not supported by very detailed business analysis. What we end up doing is creating mega monopolies in those shallow markets, distorting already fragile markets, and actually making it very difficult for small new entrants to get into that market. This is a vice that is very common with NGOs that go into areas that are considered really poor and need what we call NGO support. So if you go into these areas, you'll find few companies that have been heavily subsidized. And in most cases, the programs that they implement rarely expand in size as expected by the donor or by the program that is supporting them. The second practice that actually entrench shallow markets is the idea of creating artificial business linkages. Most donor programs in these markets are so keen to be seen to be doing something that they will end up creating linkages that are not business-like. They are simply linkages to see that there is a private sector working with a group of farmers, and little is done to undertake business analysis to find whether there is really a business to be done, whether the relationship being created is sustainable in terms of profitability and value. That in itself is a problem, and what we end up doing is creating capacity that cannot be utilized, or in some cases, creating capacity that is inappropriate for the region at any particular time. Another practice is building business models that are donor-facing right from the word go. There is now a big trend about technology and about the power of mobile telephony and all that, and we latch onto those sexy models or sexy trends, and we end up creating things that are not likely to fly. So we go into innovations that are not likely to fly, and then they are innovations that will require a long time of donor support. For me, as practitioners, we need to be careful to flow into these trends, because what we do is then create an artificial market that fizzles out when the program ends. So, what have we done to increase adoption, crowding in, and systemic change in these markets? Right. We found out that it is very difficult to actually get vibrant workers, vibrant actors in this shallow market. So we decided to use 3 different approaches. The first one is what we call action research for business model discovery. This is a case where we as a program learn together with the actors. So we develop a business model based on a very detailed business analysis, and then we go to pilot this in the marketplace, but bring along private sector actors to discover with us. What has happened in this is that after this discovery phase, immediately those who see the viability of the model then adopt it and then run with the model on their own with very minimal support from us. One case in point here is a case of getting the soybean seed production out in the market in northern Uganda. The second approach is what we call the innovation platforms. In the innovation platforms, what we do is to identify a common problem that is faced by small upcoming business in these shallow markets. For instance, we discovered that one problem that is really reducing the ability of small oil millers in northern Uganda is quality issues with regard to production of vegetable oil. So taking on such a challenge, we then bring all the actors facing the same challenge and we take them through a process of guidance, facilitation, and what we call business exchange visits, so that they can identify ways of solving the problem. And in the process, we work with them to refine their own business models that enable them then to go into markets. Through this, we have been able to get almost 9 different actors to actually go into market, put in systems for quality assurance, and are on the pathway to getting quality mark from the central government so that they can trade their businesses all over the country. The third approach is what we call business roundtables. This is slightly different from the 2 others in the sense that NU-TEC MD undertakes a detailed business analysis and goes further to build business modeling. Once this is done, then we invite all potential businesses or all possible businesses who might get value by implementing the model. We then encourage commercial collaboration and partnerships between actors who are interested in investing in the opportunity. In this way, we have been able to get over 30 businesses coming together in order to invest in those opportunities and run with the model with very minimum technical support from NU-TEC MD. The aim is to pilot ideas with potential to create systemic change with as many players as possible right from the start. In this way, we have managed to get actors going and they are able to fly with the business ideas with very minimal support from us. So I'll now focus very specifically on how we have managed to restructure the sunflower seed value chain, seed chain in northern Uganda. So the objective of this was to increase availability of improved sunflower seeds to smallholder farmers. This was to address seasonal shortages of seeds and also, in the long run, to improve supply of grains or sunflower grains to millers. So what was the problem? There are large numbers of sunflower growers in northern Uganda, estimated at about 1.5 million households. There has been in the past only one exclusive importer of hybrid sunflower seed that is suitable for northern Uganda. The seed supply has been very intermittent and sometimes even mismatched with demand. So there were always seasonal shortages. That then created opportunity for fake or adulterated sunflower seeds to be supplied into the market. This resulted into a situation where farmers resorted into using recycled seed with very low productivity, low supply of grains to processors. Many of the processors were operating below 36% capacity, and that resulted into disinvestment by processors, because if your facility is idle most of the time, then no need to invest any further. But the main problem is the whole industry was being displaced by the cheap palm oil imports as substitute for locally produced seed. So then, what did we do? The slide up there is showing a summary of the steps we undertook. But I just want to take you very quickly through the process. What we have done is we undertook an analysis of the various varieties of sunflower that is produced in northern Uganda and produced elsewhere in the world, with the aim of identifying the variety that has the right characteristics in terms of oil content, in terms of time of maturity, and in terms of its productivity per hectare. By identifying those varieties, we then realized that the variety that is available in northern Uganda, supplied by this single supplier, is the right one. But there are other varieties that are available, but they are not currently available in northern Uganda. We then went further to find out how come there is no other importer of this single variety that is suitable for northern Uganda, and we found out that there is an exclusive arrangement from the supplier company in South Africa. We then tried to find out whether there is any other possible supplier from outside Uganda who could supply sunflower seed, and we found that there is one with the same characteristic, but there is a minimum threshold that can be imported at any one time, and no distributor in Uganda could achieve that minimum threshold. So we had to come back and try to find out how do we then get this imported. So we called potential importers and asked them, what is the challenge? And we found out that they had no resources to import the volumes required, but they were keen to import. So working with them, we put in a small grant to one of them to import the first quantity of seeds to test in the market. This was done, and the test done, and the results from farmers' practice was amazing. Farmers then started asking for more of the seed. So we put in a guarantee mechanism with the supplier in South Africa to allow importers and distributors from Uganda to actually import. That then broke the monopoly by bringing in the first batch of hybrid sunflower seed. Very quickly then, we also realized that there is an importer that has identified a source of hybrid seed from India, and they were keen to import, but they didn't know how they would distribute it in Uganda. So we encouraged them to import, but then supported them to distribute using a village agent model that we had set up with other private sector players in northern Uganda. So they rode on an already established network of the last mile distributors. We also quickly discovered that there is a local variety that has very high oil content and is actually can be multiplied locally and has oil content or oil yield that is higher than the hybrid varieties. Furthermore, that particular seed is adapted to the northern Uganda climate. So it ticked all our boxes. What we have now done is we are going into a phase where we are going to work with local seed businesses in order to produce that local variety in Uganda. So this particular slide shows you the market structure before we got involved. There was only this single supplier working with its appointed agents who are then linking to farmers. And this particular structure had all the characteristics that you can associate with a monopoly. You reduce the supply when demand is highest, and you reap the benefits of short supply. What has now happened after 1.5 years of the market? We now get that look like we have on the screen. We have more than one channel farmers. The original supplier is supplier number 1, but now we have supplier number 2 and supplier number 3, and we are now developing supplier number 4. You can also see that other than working with just one appointed agents, we have developed 3 different channels. The cooperatives, farmer cooperatives is one. There are normal retailers that are able to sell seeds, and then there are what we call the village agents. All these people are able to serve the farmers. What we have done here is to increase the number of channels farmers can get seeds from. We have also widened the farmer choice by leaving the farmer to actually make a choice which particular supplier or which particular seed variety is best for him. With the 4th supplier, our aim is actually now to disrupt the prices in the seed market, because the supplier number 4 will be supplying seeds that are better oil yield, they are fast maturing, they are climate adapted, and they are cheaper by almost 60%. We hope that that will disrupt the market sufficiently to enable farmer get a lower price and actually enable us reach the really excluded farmers. That is what we have done so far. So very quickly on lessons, I hope I'm still within time, Mike.
You've run over a bit, Colin, so try and wrap up quickly, please.
Okay, so don't stick to the rule book. Market systems work does not follow rules. You need to really do it based on what is happening on the ground. Spread the risks early enough. Don't start with one. Failure is likely to be very high. We have experienced that where we went with big players and the failure rate has been higher than when you work with small, middle-level businesses. There is a missing middle in action. I mean, missing in action in these shallow markets. We tend to look for big players, but I think there are indigenous businesses that are hungry for ideas to implement. Then use instruments that reduce risk exposure. Real entrepreneurs will take up a challenge, but there are some businesses that will only get involved because a donor or a program has funds to disburse. Then constant iteration of the business model, because there are too many moving parts in shallow markets. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Collins. Great detailed explanation of how it how market systems development works on the ground in northern Uganda, and okay, congratulations for what you've achieved in that environment, which I know quite well myself. It's very challenging. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions and answers. There aren't too many questions yet in in the chat box. So if you have some questions, do throw them in. But while we do that, I wanted to actually pick up on a point which Colin made early on in his presentation, which is about the, if you like, the challenge that arises in these environments, not just because they're thin markets, but also because there's a lot of donor activity looking for ways to spend money sometimes, and there's a lot of potential for distortion. And the question I wanted to ask Ali was, businesses thrive in this kind of context where it's not only that you're dealing with, maybe a very dispersed or thin consumer base, but also there's quite a lot of distortion going on in terms of funding for what Colin's referred to as, I think, kind of false, fake business models or spurious business models. I was wondering whether there was any experience of that from MDF's work.
A couple of points on that. The first is that we do need to understand the market well enough to understand what is a viable business model, what can actually make money. I mean, so if you look at the Fiji case, a logistics provider was never going to make money just distributing ag inputs. They had to have a whole range of stuff that they transported. But having said that, you do have this issue of subsidies, and it requires, first of all, a keen eye and a real, and as Colin says, putting a real challenge out there. But the other thing that MDF found, and I really found this interesting, was that it also doesn't pay to necessarily sort of completely ignore the other programs and to sort of refuse to work with any business that is even considering working with them, because you're just cutting off options there. So if you find genuine entrepreneurs, but there is a program that is perhaps maybe providing some sort of support or finance that's somewhat reasonable, that part of the program can be linking to those. In Timor-Leste, MDF found that if they sort of said, well, we're not going to work with anybody that's not working with anybody else, well, then they didn't have any partners and there weren't any other market players there. So they had to be very careful in ensuring that there was real buy-in and skin in the game from their partners to ensure, as Colin said, that these were entrepreneurs who wanted commercially facing business models, but they also did link with other programs and look for opportunities to sort of jointly support entrepreneurs where that made sense.
Thank you, Ali. Collins, there's an interesting question from Christina Ruiz at Twin, who wanted to know whether NU-TEC has been working on coffee markets in West Nile. That sounds like a quick answer, but can you talk more generally about how you've gone about looking at incentives for investment in these very difficult parts of these difficult geographies? I mean, how do you, what are the kind of incentives that encourage private sector actors to get involved in these difficult shallow markets in places like northern Uganda and Karamoja?
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks for the question. First of all, we are only starting to explore opportunities within the coffee markets. Other parts of the NU-TEC program are already working in the coffee market, but as NU-TEC MD, we have not gone into the coffee market. Now, going into your question about what kind of incentives, let me just share with you 3 that we have used and have worked perfectly. If you are working in an area that is so heavily donor dependent, then you have to be careful that you are not throwing money at actors. So what we have done is, one, we have used what we call performance-based payment system, where we set performance milestones for actors. For instance, if we are talking about production of seeds, then we say if you produce a certain, let's say, a certain volume of seeds per acre and achieve a certain level of productivity, then we refund a certain proportion of your cost of production. And if you are able to sell that particular seed to a smallholder farmer, then again we refund to you a certain proportion of your marketing costs. In that way, you don't give money unless somebody deserves it. So that is one way that we have actually used to get actors to behave commercially. And we have calculated that incentive not to make their price be heavily subsidized, but to make their price match what is actually in the market. We do not expect them to sell any higher or any lower than what the market price for the product is in the market. Right. The second way we have used incentives is to use very interesting guarantee mechanism. We can guarantee a supplier who is supplying the market actor. For instance, when we were working in the refugee area and we wanted a supplier of groundnut seeds to supply distributors in the refugee area, we gave a guarantee to the supplier so that he could supply the distributors, but if there is any seeds that are not sold by the end of the season, then we share on a 50-50 basis the value of the unsold seeds. The third approach that we use in order to stimulate performance and to stimulate action by the actors is a case whereby we ask the actors to actually invest upfront. And in case they incur any losses that we can track and we can see with them, then we have a cost-sharing arrangement to cover their losses or to cover any, let's say if there is default, to cover those defaults that they have incurred by getting into the market space. So those are some of the ways the instruments we have used creatively and have enabled us to achieve quite some large numbers in a very short time.
No, that's very interesting. That kind of specific examples I find fascinating, Collins. The first example you just gave reminded me of the mechanism that was used on a much larger scale by the Ag Results program in Nigeria to promote aflatoxin-free groundnuts, and I think we had a webinar about that just 2 or 3 weeks ago, which people can find on the webinar page of the Beam Exchange. Maybe Isabel, you can put a link in the chat box to that webinar recording now.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that's really useful to actually have these specific examples of the sort of way you create incentives in shadow markets being described. We've only got a few minutes left. Sorry, Collins, go on.
Yes, Mike, I think if practitioners are able to look at commercial business models and especially how you promote sales in a commercial business environment, or how you create models that allow adoption of technology in a commercial setting, and then we bring those experiences into the work we do, that will make us actually think more creatively and enable us to find models that work in the areas we work in, because these are also just markets like the big markets that we are talking about.
Mm.
Yep.
Thank you. By the way, since I've drawn attention to the chat box, you'll find a few other links that Isabel has been putting up there, including links to more information about the Market Development Facility Program and the NU-TEC program. And I particularly recommend the paper there on the lessons from the phase 1 of the Market Development Facility. That's the paper 1155 by Ali and colleagues from MDF, really very interesting. Now, we are literally a couple of minutes from the end of this webinar, I'm afraid. I'll see if we can have time to squeeze in one more question for you, Ali, if that's okay. And that would be, so in general, what do you see as the best route to scale in thin markets? Is it about replication? Is it about specialization? Is it about something, a hybrid of the two?
Yeah, I would say it's about neither.
Excellent.
I think the route to scale in shallow markets is really understanding the mix of viable business models that will reach the greatest percentage of people. If you look at Fiji as an example, if you think about seedling suppliers, now there is a market where it makes business sense and viable business models is relatively small businesses that serve a sort of local area. But if you look at distributors, you need a few large ones with massive channels and often one focused sort of on each major island that you're looking at. If you look at ag lime, well, there's not much more room in the market than one local producer because the economies of scale require you to have a lime quarry. So that's, there's going to be maybe one or two suppliers. So they needed to really understand that ag inputs market and see the different business models that were going to fit together on a national level to serve the sort of highest possible percentage of the 70,000 farmers that were out there to serve. And it's a little bit different than in robust markets where I think, it is a dense market. There's room for lots of firms, and so you're sort of heading right from the start for crowding in, and then you work on other things a bit later. But in those shallow markets, you really need to think through that mix of different types of business models depending on what they are and what's appropriate for each one to reach that greater scale.
Great. Thank you very much, Ali. We've run out of time, but it has been a really interesting webinar. I mean, again, one I feel we should just put up there on the homepage of the Beam Exchange for your brilliantly clear explanation of what a market systems development program looks like on the ground in these kind of difficult market environments. So thank you so much, Ali and Collins. Really, really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed the webinar, please would you click on the link, or even if you haven't actually, could you please click on the link and send us your quick feedback. It only takes you 30 seconds just to give us some feedback on what was good or what was not good about this webinar and how we can improve them. The link is there in the chat box. It's the last one I've just put in. Or indeed, sign up for more updates from the Beam Exchange. Join our forum on the LinkedIn platform where you can discuss these questions further. And if you have more questions for Ali or Collins, you can reach them again by posting questions into the Beam forum. I'll sure that they respond to any of the questions that get placed there. So thank you very much, Ali. Thank you very much, Collins. Any final word?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this topic because I think it's going to make a lot of difference to how all of us reach out to those excluded populations in the coming years.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike, for giving me the opportunity. I think I just want to say that it's very messy business working in these shallow markets, and getting to understand the structures that govern those markets is key to finding a way to break the dominance of the few powerful players in those markets. That's what I can end with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Collins. All right, everyone, have a great day or have a great evening for those of you who are going to bed now, Ali, and we'll catch up, no doubt, at the next event. Thank you.